Recent brain studies suggest that made-up stories, far from being mere escapism, may provide the most energetic of all cerebral workouts.
Miss Catherine! 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 Miss Catherine! Catherine!
For many generations of readers, Wuthering Heights, the tragic tale of Cathy and Heathcliff, has provided that special pleasure. Its author, Emily Bronte, owed everything to her childhood and an insatiable passion for books. Over 150 years ago, Emily's father, Patrick, an Irish clergyman, came here to the remote village of Haworth with his family. He single-handedly brought up his children, a son, Bramwell, and 3 daughters, Charlotte, Anne and Emily. They would all inherit their father's zeal for the written word, and in turn create some of the masterpieces of English literature. I met Juliet Barker, a leading biographer of the Bronte family, to find out how reading moulded the minds of Patrick's children.
It was crucially important to him. I mean, you have to remember he came from a family that was basically illiterate in Ireland, a small tenant farmer family, one of many children, and he taught himself to read and write. And he knew the value of an education. At 16, he set up his own school to teach village children, and he was determined.
Patrick's own children read everything they could lay their hands on. We now know, of course, that they were building up those reading networks in their brains. Soon, they began to create their own stories.
Well, we're sitting in the parlour, and this was the powerhouse of the Bronte family, because this is where the girls, and Bramwell too as a young boy, spent a lot of their time, because this is where they would gather every day to write and to talk. They would walk around the table, arm in arm, tramping round and round, discussing plots, discussing characters, discussing the stories that they were going to write. It was one of the interesting things.
Here in the parlour, the neural circuits inside the Bronte sisters' brains conjured up new worlds and characters. They called their imaginary realms Angria and Gondal. Even in adulthood, Gondal meant everything to Emily Bronte and directly inspired her one completed novel, Wuthering Heights.
With Emily, she might be doing the housework, she might be baking bread, but she could be thinking about her imaginary characters all the time. So Gondal was crucial to her, and she couldn't break away from that. So Wuthering Heights is literally a continuation of Gondal. Particularly the figure of Heathcliff, this misanthropic, violent character.
Cathy.
In a burst of creativity, the story of Heathcliff and Cathy poured from Emily's brain onto the page.
And yet, she is not here. She's on the earth.
The words of Emily Bronte still possess the power to change minds, and even lives. Tom Palmer grew up in the next valley to Haworth. Just a few years ago, he would never have contemplated picking up a book.
I just didn't want to read books, I had other things to do.
But why? What did you think books were about? What was wrong with them?
There was nothing in them for me, there was nothing of interest. Why would I want to read a story, and why would I want to look in a book? Really, it was television, computer games, or playing football for me.
Desperate, Tom's mother gave him books about his consuming passion, football, to kick-start his reading habit, and the plan worked. Tom moved from soccer facts to the classics.
I found books that, including fiction, that I would just never have read, and one particular book was Wuthering Heights. For me, it was a revelation that I was reading about the kinds of places where I lived or went, and I was reading a story about a load of, like, sort of quite messed up Yorkshire people, and I loved it. And I remember reading, that was the first classic novel I ever read, and I absolutely loved it. and still doing it. And that made me think that I could read novels because it was relevant to me. It was about people a bit like me, or people a bit like people that I knew. And reading Wuthering Heights was actually a gateway to loads more reading.
For Tom, reading changed everything. He started writing himself, and today he's a prize-winning author of teenage fiction. Emily Bronte also believed that words could change lives. One of the most passionately expressed ideas in Wuthering Heights is that literacy liberates.
Time whereof
Go on.
the memory of man runneth to the contrary.
Yes, Madam.
Education and reading is absolutely central to Wuthering Heights. The whole point is that Heathcliff has been brought up without being taught to read or write. He's treated as a savage, so he becomes an uncivilised savage. So his way of getting his revenge on the families that's treated him like that is to take Hareton Earnshaw, the young heir, and deprive him of an education. His saving grace is that he meets the young Cathy, the second Cathy, who teaches him how to read. And she is literally releasing him from the bondage that Heathcliff has created, and she is setting him free, and you know that they are then going to get together, and that they are then going to go on to the future and break this terrible hold that Heathcliff had had on them.
Ah, gotcha! Go on, rest! Come on!
And Heathcliff, Emily's imagined character, took hold of Tom's mind in an altogether different way.
And was there anyone in Wuthering Heights that you particularly identified with?
I did. I identified with Heathcliff, definitely.
You don't look much of a Heathcliff
That's
sort
good.
of person.
I was about 20ish or something like that, and there's a lot of the brooding violence and aggression, and I had a lot of that in me. I loved him as a character, and I still do. Talking about it makes me want to read it again, just because he was so like. He reminded me of a few people that I knew from the football.
Tom had discovered the single most powerful effect of reading, the way a book opens a door into other worlds and other minds.
There's a phrase in libraries, creative reading, and I think that reading is a creative act in itself, as writing is, because you are creating something while you're reading it. You're bringing in your own experiences. It's hard to put it into words, but it's something to do with when you can get into the minds of other characters and see what they're experiencing. It makes you better at empathising. I think that sounds a bit fanciful, but I think it did make me less of a selfish person. I don't usually talk about books in this way, but I do believe that fiction has helped me see things from other people's points of view.
The Bronte sisters no doubt sensed that reading could fire up empathy in some compelling but mysterious way. But can science explain this power? Emily's sister Charlotte seemed to think it could. She was one of millions who tried out that 19th century craze phrenology. Phrenologists measured the different bumps on the head, claiming they revealed what kind of mind lay beneath. They thought that the size of the bumps provided evidence of various human capacities, such as the ability to form friendships or to feel sympathy. In other words, how good our brains were at empathizing.
Phrenology was nonsense, of course, but it wasn't so daft of Charlotte Bronte to be interested in it, because actually it was the brain science of its time. And actually the idea wasn't so daft either.
Today, neuroscientists are intrigued by our ability to empathize, what Tom Palmer called getting into the minds of other characters. At Cambridge University, Simon Baron-Cohen has taken on the challenge of discovering the roots of empathy. Simon is an expert on autism, which he calls mind blindness. In other words, an inability to imagine other minds. His work on autism led to a fascination with how reading stories can produce such powerful responses.
Fiction involves imaginary worlds in the sense of imaginary characters, not necessarily based in anything factual. And the reader, whether it's a young child or an adult, has to enter into this imaginary world. So there are various steps of imagination. You have to put yourself in the mind of the author who's creating this imaginary world, but you may also have to put yourself in the minds of the characters in the text, treating them as real and trying to empathise with the characters. So when we think of reading as purely about literacy, there's obviously an extra dimension to it, which is empathy.